Hello and welcome to the Friday Five, where I talk about one Montessori toy and one conventional toy. We compare and contrast and talk about the difference between the two. We will talk about a practical life idea, a children's book, and a parenting question that I find on the internet this week. If you're joining me live, feel free to pop your questions into the chat and you can get your parenting questions, Montessori questions, or child development questions answered live. This Montessori Friday Five is a live stream that comes in part with the Montessori Masterclass. Montessori Masterclass is a inclusive program that has self-study lessons as well as live supports this podcast and so much more. And right now through next week, it is on a Black Friday sale where you can save $200 and only and get into the masterclass for only $99. So join my newsletter, reach out to get that Black Friday deal, and let's get into our live stream. So today we're talking about, in terms of our Montessori toy versus non-Montessori toy, we're talking about mobiles. So mobiles are a dangled toy of some kind. And it's dangled because a handheld toy in the life of a child with very little motor control, a very young newborn, they're not going to be able to interact very much with that toy. And because of their limited eyesight, they're not going to be able to pull in interesting things from around the room. So by dangling a toy, we are creating accessibility in the stimuli that we're offering. So that's why we dangle a toy, is because the child's motor control and their eyesight are not mature enough for them to really interact robustly with handheld toys. So I have pictured on the left, this is a very standard Montessori mobile. It's called the Goby. It's part of sort of very standard Montessori curriculum. And then on the right, I just found a conventional mobile. And there's a couple things that I would point out in terms of the differences within these. When the child has very limited eyesight, it means that they're going to be able to perceive the highest contrast. So if you squint your eyes almost to closing them, you're probably not going to be able to completely make out everything in the room. But what you might be able to make out is the light of a wall versus the shadow of a doorway. Or you might be able to pick up something that was very dark versus something that was very light. So you might be able to make out a shadow of a computer screen that is off or on. But the point is that when the child has very limited eyesight, it's like everything is very fuzzy. And so it's hard for them to differentiate. So even though the mobile on the right, this conventional mobile, we perceive it as very sweet and beautiful, and it's got these really lovely pastel colors like pinks and light greens and this light gray and white. From the child's perspective, like if you tried to fuzz your eyes, you're not going to see any of that. So it's like it was created with a single tone, which makes it a lot harder for the child to actually see what is being provided from them. So whereas in Montessori, what we're going to see in mobiles, especially the youngest mobiles, the mobiles for the youngest child, those are going to be ones that are very high contrast so that the child actually gets to see them. And you'll see also the high contrast here with the Goby, the darkest to the lightest. So they'll be able to pull that out. Now, the Goby is not typically the mobile that children start with at the very beginning. This is as the child is developing their eyesight, they're going to start to differentiate between the colors that they're seeing. And the Goby is this lovely addition that can aid the child in this process. It can aid them if they're really interested in color and they're really interested in the perception of color. Well, let's give them color to look at, as just that's the interesting quality, is just the difference of color. And how does dark blue change its shades all the way to light blue? So that's just a sort of an interesting thing for the child to do with their eyes, much more than The forest, the sort of friendly forest creatures seen as the conventional mobile, that might be something that feels endearing and sweet from the adult perspective. The child has no perception of what that scene indicates. So they don't look at that scene and feel um like, there's this, oh, this really sweet, safe forest creature. All those things that you're conjuring up when you look at this and you think, oh, that's such a sweet mobile for a baby. You're conjuring up a whole lot of things that the child is not. So it's a mobile that's designed that for with the adult in mind as opposed to the child. And the Montessori materials, this is the number one way that differentiates them from conventional toys, is it's built with the child's development in mind. So there's a couple things that I want to point out with the Goby that are unique. So the Goby is really a great mobile for around the time when the child is extending their eyesight. So the time frame that they're doing that is around 4 months, sometimes a little bit earlier, but somewhere in that 3-4 month time frame. The child is really working on building color maturation as well as being able to see depth. So seeing across the room. So, because those two things are happening almost at the same time, what's really critical to understand with the Goby is how amazingly designed this mobile is for that particular stage of development. So, not only is the child able to see that kind of high contrast if they can't perceive the difference between those two lighter blue balls, that's okay because they're still seeing the highest contrast between the dark blue and the top blue. So we're working with the child from where they are in terms of what they perceive. It's possible that they perceive the three light ones as being basically the same color and the two dark ones. That's okay. As they look at it and it's interesting to them, they start to realize that they can perceive the actual difference in shades. And maybe they'll see all five. The other thing that the Goby is doing is you'll notice that the Goby, the balls, are slowly getting farther and farther away. So when the child is looking at this mobile, they're looking at it from the floor looking up. So they're practicing focusing on something and then focusing on something just a little bit farther away. And that is a tremendous aid to their depth perception, right? So it's going to be, it's scaffolding their depth perception as opposed to just try and see across the room. And some might say, well, babies are going to see across the room. Like we don't need to add that to them. But what so much of the Montessori materials and spaces are designed for is to allow the child to fulfill all the interest they have in the world. And they start from the beginning of being interested. And so if we dimension things, if we bring things to exactly where they are, then they're able to find concentration, find focus, and get very interested in the world around them. So the fact that the gobies, each of the balls are slightly farther away is another practice in eyesight. And the last thing I would point out about the Goby that I think is important to recognize is when the child is a newborn, so in the first couple months, they can't control their head. And so having a mobile with multiple dowels, the conventional mobile here on the right has this a little bit, but it has a wider area of reference. So when the Munari, which is another Montessori mobile, when that just sort of spins around, it's got a very wide presence. So for a child who can't control their neck and they just happen to be looking this way, the Munari is going to float at some point with the natural air currents kind of in their field of view. Now, if I'm working on my eyesight of both color and depth, and I'm really trying to see if I can perceive the difference between those two light blue shaded balls, if I'm trying to focus on it, well, it's not going to help anybody if it keeps moving around. So the Goby has a single dowel, which means that it's a relatively stable mobile so that the child can do all this interesting concentration and attention. So sometimes what I'll see is, if the child is just laying there and it doesn't appear like they're doing anything, sometimes the adult will walk up and will bat the Goby mobile. They'll bat it, and then the mobile will sort of swing back and forth, hopefully to like re-engage the child. Well, For one, I would challenge the assumption that the child needed re-engagement. They weren't asking for anything. We don't know what they're doing. And if they're not asking for anything, then we can assume that they're concentrated on something. And so we don't want to disturb them. But then, furthermore, we also don't want to bat the movie all over the place because it's actually going to yield less concentration than more, because now the thing that they're focused on keeps moving about. So, the true sort of infusion of development into the design of the mobile is going to be a hallmark of Montessori mobiles that are often not a part of conventional mobile design. So, conventional mobile design will be thinking of sort of cutesy things that adults really appreciate without imagining what is this going to look like from the child looking up, and what is the child trying to do in their development in order to utilize this and actually think that it's interesting. Before we move on from mobiles, it occurs to me that some people might say, yeah, and they're just babies. I'm just going to use whatever mobile I want. You definitely can. And from an educator standpoint, it's unanimous. We all understand that the first 3 years are the most important. And the time when parents usually tap into parenting support is toddlerhood, but toddlers are built from something. They're built from their infancy. So what happens in their infancy turns into toddlers. And so it helps the toddler, it helps the child later by having opportunities for focus, concentration, um, interest, things that are brought to their capacity instead of them feeling just incapable. All of those things make a tremendous difference to the life of the child. So now is the time. All right, so let's get into our practical life. So, our practical life today is matching socks in the laundry. This can be a really great activity for toddlers. They might not get it all right, but they do tend to want to be near us when we're doing chores. So, they want to be near us when we're cooking, when we're washing the dishes, when we're doing laundry. And sometimes, if we think about inviting the child into that task, it'll feel overwhelming for the adult, and it'll feel like their contributions are not particularly helpful, especially when it comes to the laundry. So, matching socks can be a really helpful task for the child in toddler and in primary, because it gives them something sensorial to do and it keeps them engaged and focused. Whereas folding the clothes, they can definitely learn to fold the clothes, but they could easily just not fold the clothes. There's nothing sort of re-engaging them. Whereas the socks is sort of this obvious re-engagement that if they see a sock and they see a match, oh my gosh, how could I just leave that there? I just found one. So it can be a really helpful way to involve them in something like the laundry. The way that it would generally work is either the child can help find all the socks from a laundry basket, or the adult can sort of piece these out. And then the child would have a reasonable amount. We don't want to give them a bin of 25 socks. That's probably going to be overwhelming. If you see what is being pictured, it's a basket that basically has 4 pairs of socks. That's going to be much more helpful for the child to be able to do this. So if you want to involve the child trying to pick out a few pairs of socks, the more they practice with this, the more they're going to be able to identify socks in the first place and be able to help you with the gathering of the socks. And then as they get a little bit older, they'll be able to handle a whole bin of socks and be able to sort and match those as well. So matching socks, it's not a small task. It's not a small accomplishment to invite the child in to your work. That is a really important thing. And any opportunity we have to bring the child kind of along in daily living skills, they are grateful for it and they benefit from it, so that later on they actually know how to do laundry. They know what to do with certain tasks, and it just starts small. So it might seem like a really small thing, but it's tremendous for the child's self-confidence. It's tremendous for their sense of contribution to the family, and taking care of themselves, taking care of the things that they use, as well as building actual skills of being able to notice patterns and match perceptions and take action and get their body to do the thing that they're trying to do. So it's got a lot of benefits, and it's a great practice to get into the habit of. So let's take a look at our book. Our book is Don't Touch My Hair. This is a book that is great for preschoolers. What we want to do when we think about introducing anything that's related to sort of stereotypes or overcoming oppressive practices or any kind of like child struggle that might be based in a specific identity. In the 0 to 3 space, we really want to focus on affirmations. We don't want to focus on the challenges. We want to focus on affirmations because as the child is building an understanding of the way that the world works, we don't want them to build in oppressive practices based on this is just how the world works. So we want to build in stories of joy and affirmations. And when we move into the 3 to 6 space, we want to continue to offer joyful stories and stories of all children and all communities and all cultures that are joyful and celebratory. And there are often times when the preschool age child, this is when you start seeing on the playground, you start seeing racially discriminatory behavior or just general discriminatory behavior that the child has learned from the broader systems of oppression in society to discriminate around who's in, who's out, who's the friend, who's safe, who's not. So when we get into that space, we really want to spend our 0 to 3 trying hard to share stories that are joyful, to involve the child in diverse experiences, to make sure that they have diverse representation in books, in the media that you consume, in the the places you send your child, the people you bring to your home. All those things are really important, and that can offer the child a very broad view of the world. And we still live in a society that is based on oppressive practices. So when you go to that 3 to 6 time frame, it's really important to have literary tools that can help children understand more about their actions and the impact on others. So Don't Touch My Hair is a great tool. There's several tools out there to navigate, particularly if you have a child in a white body who is touching or interested in other people's hair. That has a lot of racist history to it, and it's very othering, and it's important for if you're a family in a white body to actually address that with your child. Usually preschoolers are very happy to talk about things, and sometimes they say things that are pretty surprising. So it's really helpful to have children's books and children's literature to be able to have conversation with them around their actions and the impacts on others. So this is just one book. There's many books out there around either joyfulness around hair or actually addressing discriminatory behavior or othering behavior that is really imperative to talk to the 3 to 6 year old about. One of the things that happens around by the time the child is 6 is you see the child finding ways to be private. They want to keep the bathroom door closed. They might not want to take a bath with their younger toddler sibling anymore. They want to change. They don't want to change in front of their friends. They might want to change elsewhere. There's some sort of awareness of being private with the child after 6 that is not as common under 6. And one of the other things that they're keeping private are things in their mind. The 3 to 6 year old really will tell you what's on their mind. And the 6-year-old plus has a filter. And so it's really important to have these kind of conversations with children in the 3 to 6 time frame when they're actually telling you about them, as opposed to letting them sort of make those into private thoughts that end up becoming unconscious thoughts that end up turning into unconscious bias. So Don't Touch My Hair is a great resource amongst many other books for 3 to 6 year olds. So let's get our question up. So if battery or powered light up toys are not suggested, I'm assuming in Montessori is what the person is referring to, then what do you recommend for musical toys for an instrument? I mean, for an infant. So I guess the number one way I would answer that question is to recommend non-battery powered musical toys. Many musical instruments are not battery powered. Drums, flutes, string instruments, xylophones, um, all those like shakers, all those things don't have any battery. And so that would be the recommendation. So as opposed to I push a button on something and then it plays a whole song, um, that would not be as aligned to the child's development as just a musical toy. And I can talk more about that, but that's sort of the basic recommendation is that we don't have those toys that will light up and ding and all that. So the idea behind that is the human development is we are sensorial learners. So we learn in the real world. And we do now, modern day, have technology that can create these abstractions of the world that the child, the human child, that's not how they learn, that's not how they process. So while we have them, that still isn't how a human child processes. Goes through this. They go through in a sensorial way. So I'll give an example. We don't have a TV. We have a projector that I used to use for workshops, but now we just use it to watch things every once in a while. And we were watching the Warriors. We were watching a basketball game, and we had it projected on the wall. And we were watching the game, and my daughter was probably about 2.5 or so. And so, we don't do screens or TV with the kids. But if we're doing a communal thing like watching a sporting event like basketball, then of course that's fine because it's a communal thing. So she would kind of go in and out, sort of watching the basketball and then leaving and then coming back. And she was doing her own thing. And later on that night, we were getting ready for bed, and she asked me if the people were still here. And the basketball game had been over, and I hadn't really thought about that. And I said, we didn't have company. So I said, what people? And she said, the people in your room, are they still here? And I realized that she was talking about the basketball players. And I just thought that was such a good example of how much the child is not understanding when we give them an abstract thing. So that's very abstract, that we have this like wall that is lit up with like people on it, but the people aren't actually here. And that's very difficult for the child to understand. So any of these abstractions are going to be more complicated for the child. And what is essential to their learning is a cause and effect. That is going to be the most concrete way of learning for the child, is cause and effect. I hit this, I tap this instrument thing and it makes this sound. And I tap this other part of the xylophone and it makes a different sound. And I tap this one and it makes a third sound. And every single time I tap this one, it makes that sound, and that one. That is the kind of concrete sensorial experience the child is craving, not I push a button and a whole host of things happen that I don't understand because the only cause that I did was this. And somehow I managed to make lights and music and all kinds of stuff they don't really understand. So in terms of their learning, they're not getting very much out of that. And it's confusing, like the Warriors on the projector. So what is less confusing and what's far better for their actual learning, presumably we want to introduce musical toys because we think they're going to be good for the child is for them to actually have that engaged call and response of, I did something, it made a sound. I did something again, it made another sound. That it's constantly their engagement that is creating the next step. And that's what keeps them really well engaged. And I would highly recommend just any regular instrument. So there's lots of instruments out there from, like I said, shakers, string toys, drums, uh, xylophones, any of those things are going to be great musical toys. When you think about an infant, you're going to want to think that they're putting things in their mouth. So you want to make sure that it's safe. So the materials that are being used are going to be safe if the child puts it on their mouth, right? So if it's a wooden toy that's been dyed with different colors, is the dye that was used, is that safe for a child to ingest? Because they're basically going to chew on it. And then also just paying attention to, is it too much for them to handle? So if that, if the, if it's too much for the child, then we want to minimize what we're doing. Meaning if, an entire drum set that's too much for a very young child, but like one single flat drum, that is very common, a great instrument for a young child, especially an infant. Well, that is the end of our Friday Five. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you check out the Black Friday sale for the Montessori Masterclass, and we will be off next week, and then we will see you the following.